Welcome to our channel Elimika Mtandaoni. My name is Agustino Mogosi. Today is the first um, presentation of a series of videos on open source software adoption for healthcare organizations. In this series of videos, we'll talk about how we can adopt these open source softwares to facilitate or to enhance different activities in healthcare organizations. As we know that now open source has found its place in health information technology infrastructure that is supported by many organizations, and these infrastructure they serve organizations in several aspects such as electronic health records, medical practice management, medical information system, and a lot more. So as health informaticians, probably you are watching this as a health information system specialist. You do not know what ways, what practices, what means of which you can use open source software to support several organization functions. And here we are talking about healthcare organizations. As we know that we have what we call an open source platform. In fact, this is a new platform. It's a new paradigm for software development. In this case, software is developed with different groups that they serve as volunteers in the whole process of developing softwares. And these people, they volunteer in the whole phases of software development. You will find people volunteering in designing, volunteering in coding, volunteering in testing, debugging, distribution, and even documentation of open source projects. But open source, in fact, is experiencing an exponential growth in many healthcare, in many organizations. In fact, we have organizations such as manufacturing and production, accounting and finance, sales and marketing. A lot of organizations are now adopting open source softwares. However, the adoption of open source software in healthcare has been a little bit slow, despite its availability, despite the quality of applications for healthcare industries that are found out there. So in this series of videos, we'll describe about the meaning of open source software, the different characteristics of open source software, development of open source software, the different license types, revenue models, factors that affect the uptake of open source software, and even customization of open source software. So follow us in this video. We'll talk a lot about how you as health information system specialist will adopt open source in different organizations that we will be working on. So to start our series of videos, we'll start discussing about open source. So what is open source? If you leave aside a software, then open source is anything that people can modify, people can use, people can share just freely without any restrictions, simply because the design of such thing is publicly accessible. No one is restricted from using it. So if you talk about it, open source is something that is without restriction, that anybody can use, anybody can modify, and you can even share, simply because it is allowed to be accessible publicly. So if we are talking about open source software, then this is a kind of software with the source code that anyone can change, or anyone can use, anyone can modify, or anyone can enhance. So in fact, a source code, what is a source code? A source code in is like a building block that is used by developers of softwares and different applications. It's a kind of building block, and in fact it's a fundamental component of a computer program that is created by your programmer, and it can be read and it can be easily understood by a human being. But this source code can be of two types. It can be proprietary, or it can be open. And the license agreements between these two source codes, either proprietary source code or open source code, they often reflect their distinction. So to differentiate between a proprietary source code and an open source code, it depends on the type of license that a software a developer uses. So when a user installs a software suite, let's say a Microsoft Office program, for example, that kind of source code is called the proprietary source code, because Microsoft only gives its customer access to the software which is compiled in some executable files, and these files are associated with a kind of libraries that in fact those libraries are required so that they can call program functions. So these developers use source code to write some additional code, which we can specify different actions, we can specify different functions that organizations need from the program. So if we are talking about open source code, this kind of code is a free source code that is made available to any developer to build a software. So these developers, once they adopt or once they decide to use an open source software, they get it for free. So speaking of the word free doesn't mean that free in terms of charge, but it is free in terms of use, free in terms of modification, free in terms of enhancement, etc., etc. So that is the meaning of open source. Now, let's talk about the open source initiative. What is this open source initiative? In fact, this is a corporation. It's a public benefit corporation whose aim is to promote and to protect the open source software, and even to protect the open source communities. Open source initiative uses what we call open source definition to determine whether it considers a certain software a license, an open source, or not open source. So for a software to be called open source, or a software not to be called open source, then it is this organization, this corporation that determines, or that approves that a certain software is to be called an open source, and that is done through an open source definition. Speaking of open source definition, in fact, is a public document that is published by open source initiative organization to determine whether a software license can be labeled with the open source certification mark. So if you come to develop an open source software, then for it to be officially known as an open source software, then it should adhere to an open source definition. It must adhere to an open source definition, and that definition is published through a certain document that we call an open source definition. So that is what it means by an open source definition. But let's have more to talk about open source initiative. In fact, the open source initiative, they are the ones that champions software freedom in society, and they do this through the following. The open source initiative, they provide education to the society about the open source softwares. They enhance, or they support what we call collaboration, and they provide a kind of infrastructure, cloud source infrastructure, to facilitate or to develop, to promote open source usage and open source communities. And in this case, they do steward the open source definition, and they prevent abuse of the IDOs, abuse of the ethos inherent to the open source movement. In fact, open source software is made up of many people and distributed under an open source definition compliant licenses. So a license that is given to a software that is to be called open source software, then it should be compliant with the license of open source definition. So it is the open source initiative, that organization, which grants all the rights to use a software, all the rights to study the software, all the rights to change and share the software in a modified and unmodified form. So it gives a software freedom, which is very essential to enable community development of the open source software. So that is what it means by open source initiative. So as we have said, that the open source initiatives determines whether the software is open source or not through the use of open source definition. Now let's discuss about open source definition. Open source definition provides a number of criteria that once they are followed, once these criteria are followed, while you are someone has developed his or her software, then once all these criteria are followed, then we can say that that kind of software is called an open source software. Speaking of open source software, doesn't mean only to have access to open source code. There should be a number of criteria that should be followed, and these are free distribution, integrity of author's source code, license must be specific to the product, the source code, no discrimination against persons or groups, license must not restrict other software, derived works, distribution of license, and license must be technology neutral. So these are the characteristics of an open source software. So we will go and discuss one after another, starting with the free redistribution. We talk about redistribution. That means the software has already been distributed, but once you have adopted or once you have used a software, you are not restricted. You are not restricted to redistribute it, to give it away. You can decide to give it away, or you can decide to sell it, or you can decide to do anything with it. So speaking of free redistribution, it means that the license shall not require any fee, any money from the person who has modified the open source software from him. So that is the first criteria. The second criteria is about the source code. Once you have developed your open source software, then the source code, it must include the source code, and you should allow distribution of those source code in form of a compiled form and uncompiled form. So where some form of a product is not distributed with the source code, there must be a well-publicized means of obtaining the source code for no more than a reasonable reproduction cost. So this means that if you decide to distribute your open source software in a compiled form, then you must provide another way of which a person can get the source code. And the way that you provide for a person to get such source code should not be costful. Only the cost that a person should incur is an internet cost, but a provision of source code should be with no charge. So that is another criteria. The third criteria is about derived works. A license, an open source license, must allow modifications of the software and their derived works. So if you decide to say that your software is open source, then you should allow for the people that acquire such software to modify it, and you should allow even the derived works. That means if that software has been adopted in a certain organization and they have modified, then the other people that will modify the modified software should also not be restricted. You should allow them to distribute under the same terms as the license of the original software. So that is a criteria. But another thing is about integrity of author's source code. Integrity of author's source code. If the license allows the distribution of patch files, for example, there is a distribution of patch files, then and the patch files of the same source code, then that license may restrict source code from being distributed in a modified form, unless the license may require the derived works to carry a different name or a different version number from the original software. So if your software produces patch files often, then you may restrict it not to be modified, because the patches probably have a kind of function that they should call or whatever. If the person wants to modify, then you can allow that person to create or to create a different name for that software. So you have to maintain integrity of author if at all there are distribution of patch files. There should not be any discrimination against persons or groups. So if you have decided to label your software as open source, then you should not discriminate any person. So if you have your beliefs or your traditions, then leave your traditions, your beliefs out there, because you have decided your software to be an open source. Then you shouldn't discriminate anyone from using it. You should not discriminate anyone from modifying it or from sharing it. Discrimination also, you shouldn't discriminate any field of endeavor. You should not say that, for example, this software will only be used for maybe business issues, or for research issues, or for agricultural issues. You should not restrict any field of endeavor. Another one is the distribution of license. Speaking of rights that have been attached to a certain program that has been labeled as an open source, then such rights must apply to all, or to all programs that are redistributed after the first one has been distributed. And there must not be a need for execution of additional licenses by those parties. So the distribution of license must apply to all whom the program is redistributed, and without any need of execution of new licenses by other parties. That is another criteria. Another criteria is license must not be specific to a product. You cannot just say this license will be only for this software and not other softwares. The rights attached to the program must not depend on the programs that is being part of that software distribution. For example, if the program is extracted from that distribution and is used and distributed within the terms of other programs or other licenses, then it should not be specifically say only to this kind of product. All other products or other programs redistributed should have the same rights as those that are granted in conjunction with the original software distribution. So if the software distribution gives the first software distribution gives rights 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then the sequential programs have those rights too, so they can have such rights too. It is not only for that first product, it applies to all other products, the distributed products. Then license must not restrict other software. The license must not place any kind of restrictions on other softwares that are distributed along with the licensed software. For example, you may integrate your software with another software, so there should not be any kind of restrictions other software from using the open source software. For example, the license must not insist that all other programs distributed on the same medium must be open source software. So that means if you are using an open source software, you can integrate it with the proprietary software, and you shouldn't restrict the proprietary software from using the open source software or from integrating with the open source software. Another criteria is license must be technology neutral. So you should not dedicate, or you should not fall under a single or individual technology or a single style of interface. It should be flexible. It should allow the people that have decided to use your open source software to use any other technologies or any other interface styles, etc. With open source, we have a number of benefits. Here we can explain the three most important benefits of open source software. The first one is cost. Majority of open source software is distributed freely, so making it very cost effective, because as we have seen that open source software can be given for free. They can be given for free. So open source software benefits also healthcare organizations in many ways. For example, in financial, as we have said, in cost, where open source software does not charge any license fees for their code, and they are freeing funds for other IT initiatives. Another benefit of open source software is flexibility. Proprietary software often require users to accept the terms and conditions of use, which in the end restrict the ways in which developers and programmers can utilize a given product. However, with open source software, community members have open access to the source code and are able to use it in any way they see fit. So the flexibility is there. There we have a freedom with the source code, which allows developers to create unique solutions, which allows the developers to come up with different innovations or unique innovations which can then be built up on by other members of the community. So that is another benefit. There is another benefit of open source software, that is security and transparency. We have something like crowdsourcing. Crowdsourcing actually facilitates a constant process of peer review. So if we allow a software to be reviewed, I remember Linus Torvalds said, if given enough eyeballs, all bugs can be seen. So that means developers in open source community are constantly reviewing the code. So building on the bugs or whatever. In that case, they build improvements, and hence they close gaps in the security. This process actually holds community members accountable for their contribution, and in that case, it cuts down the time it takes to push out an update. So the point of security is solved simply because there is a kind of peer review, and members contribute in building improvements, and in that case they close any gaps that they appear. Now as we are proceeding, we are reaching to the end of our first video. We'll talk about healthcare open source softwares. In healthcare, we have a number of activities. We have a number of aspects. We have a number of functions within healthcare organizations. So open source software can serve in different functions. For example, it can serve in electronic records, it can serve in medical practice management, it can serve in medical information, it can serve in public health management, etc., in biosurveillance, and a lot more. So here we will provide some few examples that in the next videos we will be explaining, we will be analyzing these software one after another before we proceed with other videos. So we have software for public health and the biosurveillance. For example, software called EpiInfo. This kind of software is a statistical software, and it is used for epidemiology. As we know that epidemiology is the study and analysis of distribution. Speaking of distribution means who, when, where, or patterns and determinants of health and diseases conditions in a certain population. So EpiInfo is a statistical software for epidemiology, and it is developed by Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, where it is this center is found in Atlanta, Georgia. We have ESP, we'll be explaining about it. We have a number of electronic records and medical practice management. For example, speaking of electronic medical records and medical practice management, these kind of software, they enable the health providers to maintain the medical and the treatment history of patients. So we have a number of softwares in there that are open source. One is Clear Health. In fact, this uses a technology of PHP and JavaScript, and it is for electronic medical recording and practice management. It has a lot of functions such as scheduling and billing and electronic medical recording. We have what we call OpenEMR. OpenEMR is also an open source software that uses PHP, JavaScript, and MySQL. It is also an electronic medical records, and it provides functions such as patient's portal and functions like prescriptions, etc. And it falls under a license called the GNU GPL in the next lectures we'll be talking about these licenses, etc. The main target of open EMRIs, the target settings for that is for emergency departments and for smaller practices. We have another electronic medical record, we call it Open MRIs, that uses Java technology, and it follows under license of MPL. Others are like FreeMed. We have Open Clinic that is designed for private clinics. It is designed for surgeries and private doctors. All those software, they fall under a function called the electronic record and medical practice management. We have another category which we call it health management. There we find two important softwares. One is DHIS. It is a district health management information system, and it is also a data warehouse, and this is released under a license called the BSD. We will talk about that kind of license in the next lectures. But we have another open source software for health management that was developed by University of Dar es Salaam. It is called the Human Resource for Health Information System, and it is for management of human resources for health. So that is another software. So we will be discussing about these softwares to see their advantages, their disadvantages, the technologies that they use, the licenses that they use in the coming videos. So thank you very much for listening. This is Elimika Mtandaoni, and this is the first video in the series of videos that will be following. So please subscribe, share, and comment. If you have any question, ask us. We'll be happy to answer your questions. This is Elimika Mtandaoni. Ciao.